The attic of Thorn Manor did not breathe. It merely collected the exhaled misery of the floors below. It was a place of discarded things, broken mahogany chairs with horsehair stuffing spilling out like internal organs, trunks filled with moth-eaten silks of a mother Elizabeth Sterling could barely remember, and a heavy, stagnant scent of dust that had forgotten the touch of the wind. In this skeletal kingdom, Elizabeth Sterling was the only living thing, huddled over a makeshift desk composed of a tea crate. She worked by the light of a stolen candle, a thick stub of beeswax liberated from the drawing room after Lady Clarissa had retired. The light was a flickering companion, casting shadows against the sloped rafters, but it was enough to illuminate the columns of figures that marched across the scraps of parchment. Elizabeth Sterling did not look like the slow-witted girl her stepmother described to the local gentry with practiced pity. Her spine was a straight, uncompromising line, and her eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, were sharp with an intelligence Thorn Manor was not yet prepared to contain. Her fingers were permanently stained with ink at the tips, a mark of her secret labor that she spent every morning scrubbing with pumice stones until her skin was raw. To the world, she was a drudge, a silent shadow who carried tea trays and mended the fine lace of Lucinda and Seraphina. But here in the cold sanctuary of the eaves, she was a cartographer of corruption. Before her lay a pile of forged receipts, the discarded debris of Lady Clarissa's vanity. Clarissa was a woman of expensive tastes and an even more expensive lack of conscience. She spent the Sterling inheritance on French silks and imported perfumes while maintaining a social facade as hollow as a drum. To hide mounting debts, she had created a labyrinth of false entries in the house ledgers, assuming no one, least of all Elizabeth Sterling, would ever look for the exit. But Elizabeth had found the thread. She had taught herself a secret alphabet where every digit told a truth that words attempted to mask. Elizabeth believed a ledger was the one honest room in the world. It did not sneer, it did not lie, and it did not demand she be anything other than precise. She recorded the latest discrepancy in her own private book, a volume bound in rough canvas that she hid beneath a loose floorboard. Her current discovery was particularly damning. There was a payment of £50 for roof repairs that had never occurred, the sum flowing instead to settle a bill for Lucinda's latest bonnet. Elizabeth Sterling's quill scratched against paper, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. Thorn Manor felt as though it were holding its breath, a decaying beast that knew its bones were being picked clean. She calculated the total embezzlement over the last 7 years. The same 7 years Lady Clarissa had reigned as mistress, and the figure was staggering. It was the lifeblood of the estate, the dowries of the tenants' daughters, and Elizabeth's own future. Elizabeth Sterling had learned to see the world through the lens of solvency. When she looked at a velvet curtain, she did not see beauty. She saw 3 months of unpaid wages for the stable hands. When she looked at the lavish dinners served downstairs, she saw the dwindling stores of grain that would leave the village hungry by February. This was her competence, her silent power. She was the only person in the house who knew how close they were to the precipice. Lady Clarissa might possess the titles, but Elizabeth possessed the truth. Numbers don't lie, she thought, her lips thinning. People lie about them. I am the payment, sir. She whispered to the shadows, recalling how the debt collector, Mr. Blackwood, had looked at her. Clarissa intended to pay for her crimes by selling Elizabeth Sterling off to a man who would never ask to see the books. But as she watched the beeswax candle gutter and die, Elizabeth Sterling knew she was no longer a victim waiting for a rescue. She was a creditor waiting for a settlement. She blew out the flame, the smell of burnt wick filling her lungs, and sat in absolute darkness, her mind racing through the arithmetic of survival. The transition from the attic to the library was a descent through the layers of a mausoleum. Elizabeth Sterling moved with the practiced silence of a ghost, her feet knowing which floorboards groaned and which remained stoic. The house was a living history of her own erasure, the portraits of Sterling ancestors staring down with painted eyes. She needed the main estate ledger, Clarissa kept locked in the mahogany desk. Elizabeth Sterling had spent weeks observing the key's location. On this specific night, she needed to cross-reference the village merchant's accounts with Clarissa's forged entries. If she could prove the merchant, Mr. Miller, had never received funds for the winter grain, she would have the final piece of the puzzle. The library smelled of old leather and wood smoke. The air felt charged as if a storm were brewing within the walls. She did not bother with a candle. Moonlight spilled through arched windows in silver ribbons. She reached the desk, her hand trembling as she felt for the hidden latch. The wood was cold, a piece of dark history that had seen better men than those who currently occupied the manor. She had just eased the heavy ledger onto the desktop when a voice caught deep as cold as a mountain stream cut through the darkness. The library is an unusual place for a housemaid to find herself at 2 a.m, particularly when she is armed with a quill and an inkpot. Elizabeth Sterling froze. Her heart did not race, it stilled, a trapped bird aware of the hawk circling above. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she slowly straightened her spine, her fingers resting on the leather binding. She recognized the weight of the presence behind her. It was a dominant energy, a stillness that made the shadows withdraw. Arthur Vance, the Duke of Malvern, stood by the cold fireplace, his broad shoulders casting a massive shadow against rows of ancient books. He was not in his evening finery. He wore a heavy coat of dark wool over a plain linen shirt, and his grey eyes, the color of a sky that has not decided whether to clear, were fixed on her with intensity. He had been a guest for 3 days, a man who had worn his grief like weather for 7 years. To the household, he was a formidable aristocrat settling an old debt. To Elizabeth Sterling, he had been a silent observer, a man whose presence felt like a judgment. "I am not a housemaid, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. She turned to face him, moonlight catching the ink stains on her fingertips and the defiant tilt of her chin. She did not drop into a submissive curtsy, and this is not a random intrusion, it is an audit. Arthur Vance moved then, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug. He did not approach with the arrogance of rank, but with the scrupulous curiosity of a man who had stumbled upon a miracle in a graveyard. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the threadbare dress. He saw the way she held herself, the eyes that did not flicker with fear but with calculating intelligence. "An audit," Duke Arthur repeated, his voice dropping an octave. He reached out, his hand hovering near the ledger. "A dangerous thing to conduct in a house built on gilded illusions. Most people in your position prefer to remain blind. It is a more comfortable way to survive the winter. Being seen by the right person was not the danger, sir," Elizabeth Sterling countered, her gaze locking with his. "It was the only safety worth the name, and I find I have a constitutional inability to ignore a column that does not balance. A clean balance sheet is the sole sanctuary of truth, and this house is currently filled with lies." Arthur Vance stilled. For a moment the silence, it seemed, had teeth. He observed her manner of examining the book, not as an object of wealth, but as a puzzle to be solved. He had been investigating this estate for months, suspecting the Sterling lineage was being dismantled by Lady Clarissa. He had expected to find a house of fools. Instead, he had found a girl with ink on her hands and a mind that matched his own. "I have been looking at the numbers of this estate for 3 days, Duke Arthur said, his voice hoarse. They are a mess of contradictions. A sorrow wearing a man's coat could not find the bottom of it, let alone a man distracted by the facade of hospitality." "That is because you are looking at what is written on the page," Elizabeth Sterling said, stepping closer. "In a house like this, you must look at what is missing. The silence in a ledger is often louder than the entries. You must look at the ink that was never spilled and the receipts that were never filed." She turned the book toward him, her finger pointing to a specific line of arithmetic. The moonlight was enough for a man of his perception. He saw the correction she had made in the margin, a minute, precise notion that reconciled a 3-year-old error in the grain tithes. It was a masterstroke of accounting, a piece of forensic brilliance born of necessity and polished by isolation. Arthur Vance looked at her fingers, the ink, the calluses, the sheer labor of her mind. In 7 years, she was the first person who had looked at him and not seen a grave. He felt the ice around his heart begin a slow, agonizing thaw. "Who are you truly, Elizabeth Sterling?" he whispered. "I am the one who keeps the count when everyone else has forgotten how to weigh the cost," she replied, her voice a shadow of a promise. "And the debt is nearly due. Lady Clarissa thinks I cannot read the world, but I have read every secret she has tried to bury in these pages." Arthur Vance did not answer immediately. He watched as she closed the book with a definitive thud, the sound echoing through the empty library like a gavel. The manor was no longer paralyzed in anticipation. It was waiting for the first strike of the clock. Duke Arthur saw the fire beneath the ash of her plainness, and he knew the dinner party scheduled for the following evening would not be the triumph Lady Clarissa expected. It would be a reckoning. He reached out and touched the edge of the ledger where her hand had been. The wood was no longer cold. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "Tomorrow we shall see how the accounts finally settle. I believe it is time the Malvern Black Book had a new reader." Elizabeth Sterling nodded once, a sharp movement of acknowledgement. She turned and slipped back into the shadows. Arthur Vance remained in the moonlit library, his hand still resting on the mahogany desk, feeling the lingering warmth of a girl who was far more than she seemed. He had come to Thorn Manor to collect a debt of money, but he realized now that he might leave with something far more precious, the recovery of a soul that refused to be diminished by the darkness. He stood there for a long time, watching the silver light shift across the floor, the silent architecture of the house finally beginning to feel like a home instead of a mausoleum. Arthur Vance stood in the moonlit library of Thorn Manor, the silence of the house having teeth that gnawed at his memory. Before he had ever stepped through these rotting gates as a formal guest, before he had ever looked upon the decay of the Sterling name and the crumbling facade of their ancestral home, he had seen her. It had been 3 weeks since that rain-slicked afternoon in the village of Oakhaven. Yet the image of her remained as sharp as a diamond cut in his mind. He closed his eyes, allowing the smell of damp slate, old paper, and approaching rain to pull him back to the day his frozen heart first began to thaw. The village of Oakhaven was a cluster of stone huddled against the English countryside, a place where secrets were often buried as deep as the winter crops. The Golden Fleece Inn sat at its center, breathing a mixture of peat smoke, damp wool, and the sharp scent of ale that had turned. It was there that Arthur Vance, traveling incognito in a charcoal coat that whispered of wealth but did not scream of a dukedom, had first encountered the girl who would shatter his 7 years of curated silence. He sat in a corner stall, a man who had worn his grief like weather, watching the world through the rim of a battered pewter mug. The common room was a cacophony of minor injustices. Thomas Miller, the village merchant, was engaged in a desperate struggle with a carter who possessed the physical girth of an ox and the intellectual flexibility of a stone. A counting board sat between them, its wooden beads scattered in financial chaos. Mr. Miller was a man of means and large anxieties, his hands trembling as he tried to explain a discrepancy in grain tallies that threatened to ruin his solvency. "The tally is 11 bushels short," Mr. Miller cried, his voice cracking like dry parchment as he pointed at the ledgers. The carter merely grunted, a wall of granite ignorance. "Pay the debt, or I let the next load rot in the rain." Elizabeth Sterling was standing by the hearth, her pelisse damp from the drizzle, and a small basket of herbs at her feet. She had been sent on a drudge's errand for the apothecary of the estate, a manual task deliberately meant to keep her out of the sight of Lady Clarissa. She did not move at first, but her sea-grey eyes were fixed on the counting board with an intensity that Arthur Vance found suddenly inexplicably unsettling. She was a girl in a threadbare dress, yet she possessed a stillness that commanded the air in a room full of loud, angry men. When she spoke, her voice was not a fluttering soprano, but a truth-telling weight that cut through the noise. "The discrepancy is not in the delivery, Mr. Miller," Elizabeth Sterling said, stepping forward. She did not wait for an invitation. Her darkened fingers moved toward the counting board with the grace of a master musician approaching a pianoforte. "You calculate by the Winchester bushel, the standard of the crown," she explained, her voice carrying an absolute, cool authority over the dim room. "But the carter's load is measured by the local customary strike of the northern counties." Arthur Vance leaned forward, his mug forgotten on the scratch table. He watched as her hands, marked by the labor of a secret life, began to move the beads. She did not hesitate. She moved with a frightening competence, seeing the world entirely in the architecture of numbers. "By subtracting the weight of the damp sacks and adjusting for the strike, the deficit vanishes," she continued, her voice scrupulously precise. She looked the merchant squarely in the eye. "You have exactly what you ordered." Then she turned to the carter, her gaze hard as flint. "And you are owed an additional 4p for the extra mileage caused by the bridge closure. The math is simple, provided one is willing to look at the truth instead of the grievance." The room fell completely silent. In 30 seconds, Elizabeth Sterling had resolved a conflict that had festered for an hour. She did not linger for thanks or wait for applause. She adjusted her shawl and walked back into the cold rain, leaving a vacuum of awe in her wake. Arthur Vance remained in his corner, his heart beating with a rhythm he had not felt in years. He saw the ink on her fingertips as a sacred signature. He knew then that he would find her again. A fire like that could not be buried in the mud for long. The transition from the rustic honesty of the inn to the cold, iron-hard tension of the dining room at Thorn Manor was like moving from clean rain into a room filled with the rot of hidden secrets. That evening, the residence was choked with tension as the family gathered for a high-stakes dinner. Duke Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his presence a silent weight that the others tried and miserably failed to ignore. Across from him sat Lady Clarissa, draped in heavy silks that the estate could no longer afford, flanked by her daughters, Lucinda and Seraphina. At the far end of the table, seated almost in the shadows, was Mr. Blackwood. He was a man whose smile was as sharp as a razor, and his eyes rarely left Elizabeth Sterling, who sat in her usual place of forced insignificance. The candlelight flickered over the chipped china and the tarnished silver, highlighting the financial decay that Lady Clarissa attempted to hide with excessive lace and desperate, endless chatter. The conversation turned toward the management of the estate, a subject Lady Clarissa handled with brittle, unearned confidence. A quiet, simple wife would be a profound blessing for a man with a busy career in the north, Mr. Blackwood mentioned casually, though his gaze remained predatory and calculating as he stared at Elizabeth across the table. Lady Clarissa let out a sharp, brittle laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She looked at Elizabeth with a mask of unvarnished cruelty. "She is indeed quiet, Mr. Blackwood, but mostly because there is nothing behind her silence. She cannot even read, Mr. Blackwood," Lady Clarissa sneered, her voice carrying across the table to ensure Duke Arthur heard every cruel syllable. "I have spent 7 years ensuring her mind remained as stagnant as the dust in the attic. She is a blank slate, a creature of dull obedience who would never trouble a husband with questions or opinions. Lucinda and Serafina giggled behind their napkins, their eyes bright with the reflected cruelty of their mother. Elizabeth Sterling did not lower her head. She remained perfectly still, her spine straight and her face a study in composure, though her ink-stained fingertips tightened slightly against the fabric of her threadbare skirt. Duke Arthur watched her, his grey eyes like a storm that had not yet broken. The Duke noted how she endured the public humiliation with a dignity that none of the women in expensive silks could ever hope to possess. He noted the way Lady Clarissa and Mr. Blackwood exchanged a look of mutual understanding, a silent agreement to sell a human life as if it were a simple entry in a trade ledger. Hours later, the moon climbed high over the manor, casting long, skeletal shadows across the library floor. Elizabeth Sterling sat at the heavy mahogany desk, her spine straight despite the crushing weight of the day's domestic labor. She was not the illiterate ghost Lady Clarissa believed her to be. Before her lay a stack of estate records she had retrieved from the back of a damp cabinet, and beside them her canvas-bound private ledger. The heavy oak door creaked open, and the rich scent of bergamot and worn leather preceded the man who entered. Duke Arthur did not carry a candle. He moved through the darkness as if he were constitutionally a part of it. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes fixing on the vast array of papers spread before her. "I did not realize the library hosted such a dedicated scholar at this hour," he noted, his voice level, but carrying a thread of genuine, unmistakable curiosity. She made no sudden movements. She simply looked up, the flickering candlelight catching the silver reflection in her eyes. "I find that numbers speak most clearly when the rest of the house is silent," she replied, her tone perfectly even, betraying no fear of his rank or presence. Duke Arthur moved closer, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over her workspace. His gaze fell on a specific page of the estate ledger. "You have been looking at the accounts for the West Wing roof repairs." Elizabeth Sterling tapped a finger against a line of neat, black script. "According to an entry from last spring, £50 was paid to a contractor for slate and timber," she explained, tracing the ink with her permanently stained fingertip. "It is a significant sum for a roof that still leaks whenever the wind turns north." Duke Arthur frowned, leaning over the massive desk. The sheer physical proximity of his imposing frame would have intimidated a lesser woman, but Elizabeth did not retreat. £50 is indeed a king's ransom for a repair that was never completed, he agreed quietly. "It was never meant to be completed," Elizabeth Sterling said, her voice dropping to a cool, clinical tone of an auditor exposing a crime. "If you were to cross-reference this date with the merchant receipts from the village, you would find a payment of the exact same amount made to a milliner in London. The £50 did not buy slate. It bought 3 silk bonnets and a French lace parasol for Lucinda." She closed her private ledger with a quiet but definitive sound that echoed like a gavel. The roofing contractor was paid only in promises, while the dressmaker was paid in thorn gold. Duke Arthur stood very still, the silence in the library suddenly feeling heavy with the enormous weight of her revelation. He looked from the ledger to the girl, seeing the dark, smudged digits that Lady Clarissa had mocked in front of the entire dinner table. He realized that Elizabeth Sterling had not just found a simple mathematical mistake. She had uncovered a deliberate act of embezzlement disguised as domestic maintenance. This was the precise £50 fraud that had hollowed out the safety of the estate, stolen away one bonnet at a time. "You see things that others are trained to ignore," Duke Arthur whispered, his tone vibrating with a profound, sudden reverence. "You look at a ledger and see the truth of a human heart." Elizabeth Sterling met his gaze without blinking, finding absolute parity in his grey eyes. "A book of accounts is an incorruptible refuge," she replied. "It does not care for social standing or the lies people tell themselves. It only cares for the balance." The Duke reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat and withdrew a small, leather-bound volume sealed with a black wax crest. It was his private financial folio, the private record of his own vast and troubled holdings. It was a book that contained secrets of state, unpaid loyalties, and the complex financial legacy of a powerful dukedom. He set it on the desk between them, the gold lettering on the spine glinting in the dying firelight. "I have spent 7 years looking for someone who could read the language of my house," he told her, the admission pulled from a place of deep frozen grief. "My own stewards have failed to reconcile the debts of my soul, let alone the numbers in this book. It is a labyrinth of 1,000 entries, many of them far more dangerous than a few stolen bonnets." He paused, his calloused hand resting on the cover of the ledger as if it were a sacred, terrible object. "If you can find the truth in a decaying manner like this," he said, holding her gaze with an intensity that finally burned away the cold, "I wonder what you might find in a house as large as Malvern. Tomorrow, I would have you read this book. I would have you look at my world and tell me where the light has gone." Elizabeth looked at the secret ledger, the symbol of absolute trust, and then back at the man who had worn his grief like a shroud for 7 years. For the first time, the architecture of her own soul felt as though it were expanding, moving from the cold, stagnant attic toward a horizon she had never dared to imagine. "I will read it," she told him, her voice a steady, unbreakable beacon in the dark. "And I will tell you exactly what the numbers say. Numbers do not lie, even when the people who write them have forgotten how to speak the truth." Duke Arthur nodded, a slow, solemn movement of deep acknowledgement. He stepped back into the shadows, leaving Elizabeth Sterling alone with the ledgers and the flickering candle. The estate remained suspended in an anxious hush, but the air was no longer stagnant. The debt was being recalculated, and for the first time in 7 years, the silence of Thorn Manor did not have it had hope. The dawn at Thorn Manor arrived not as a herald of light, but as a persistent creditor, cold and grey, demanding payment from the exhausted stone. Elizabeth Sterling watched the sun crawl over the damp slate of the stables from her attic window, her mind still vibrating with the frequency of the numbers she had shared with the Duke in the dead of night. The library encounter had shifted something fundamental in the architecture of her world. She no longer felt like a ghost haunting the corners of her own inheritance. She felt like a sentinel guarding a gate that only she knew how to lock. His Grace's personal volume remained in the private chambers of Arthur Vance, a weight she could feel through the very floorboards of the house, representing a trust that was both a sanctuary and a peril. It was a secret ledger that contained the truth of a great house, and she was the only one who could read the code of its survival. Elizabeth Sterling descended the narrow servants' stairs, her movements precise and hushed, her spine as straight as a ledger line. The house was a living body, and this morning it felt feverish and unsettled. Lady Clarissa had been awake since the first bell, her voice a sharp, percussive instrument that dictated the frantic preparations for the evening's arrival. Although Duke Arthur had been a guest for several days, this morning marked the formal commencement of their financial negotiations. To the world, it was a meeting of peers intended to settle a debt. To Elizabeth, it was a forensic examination of a crime scene. She entered the morning room just as the heavy oak doors were thrown open to admit the chill of the morning and the imposing presence of the Master of Malvern. Arthur Vance entered the room with the measured pace of a man who understood the geometry of power and the weight of silence. He wore a coat of deep charcoal wool, the fabric absorbing the meager light, making him appear as a solid anchor in a room filled with Lady Clarissa's frantic, gilded fluff. He did not look at Elizabeth immediately, but she felt his awareness of her presence as a physical heat. It was a shared secret, a silent ledger they were writing together in the margins of the day. Lady Clarissa was already at the table, her invitation cards for the upcoming gala spread out like a winning hand of whist, her face a mask of practiced, aristocratic grace that hid the frantic, desperate arithmetic of her debts. "Duke Arthur," Lady Clarissa began, her voice a brittle chime that failed to hide her nerves. "I trust you slept well despite the lamentable state of our countryside air. We are so very eager to settle these tedious matters of the estate so that we may focus on the gala. It is to be the event of the season, a true restoration of the Thorn name, and I am certain you will find the arrangements most agreeable." Arthur Vance did not sit. He moved to the window, his grey eyes, the colour of a sky that had not decided whether to clear, fixed on the distant horizon where the hills met the mist. "The air is honest, Lady Clarissa. It does not pretend to be warmer than it is. I find that refreshing in a world built on facades. As for the estate, the numbers I have reviewed suggest that the restoration you speak of is built on a foundation of shifting sand and unpaid promises." He turned then, his gaze drifting seemingly by accident to where Elizabeth was quietly arranging the tea service. He noticed the way she handled the porcelain, her touch light yet firm, the dark smudged tips partially obscured by the silver polish she had been forced to use. He saw the marks of her labor and the intelligence in her eyes, and for a moment the room felt smaller, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the guest or the host. "I was reviewing the interest rates on the Northern holdings last night," Duke Arthur said, his voice dropping into a register of strategic testing that only one person in the room was meant to understand, a complex matter of compound debt that seems to have confounded even my most scrupulous stewards in London. They insist the deficit is 4%, but my own calculations suggest a variance that would render the entire ledger insolvent within a year. He paused, a deliberate silence that hung in the air, like a question waiting for an answer. The young accountant kept her focus on the tea tray, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She heard the number he had cited, 4%. It was an error, a subtle, deliberate trap laid in the middle of the conversation to see if she would catch it. The variance was not 4%. If one accounted for the deferred land tax and the missing grain tithes she had discovered in the secret alphabet of her own books, the true figure was closer to 6.25. "Numbers are a tedious business for a gentleman," Lady Clarissa said, waving her hand as if to dismiss a persistent fly. "I am sure Elizabeth here could not even begin to comprehend such talk. She has a constitutional inability to grasp anything more complex than a laundry list or a recipe for gruel. Is that not right, Elizabeth? Do not stand there like a statue. The tea for Duke Arthur is growing cold, and you are wasting the morning. It is, as you say, a complex matter, Duke Arthur, Elizabeth said, her voice a steady, unbreakable thread that cut through Clarissa's insults. She poured the tea, the liquid steaming in the cold room. Though I have often found that when a deficit seems to vanish or double, it is usually because someone has forgotten to account for the true weight of the sacks, or perhaps the hidden cost of the silk bonnets. Arthur Vance's eyes flared with a sudden, sharp light of recognition. He saw the way her hand remained perfectly steady as she delivered the hidden truth. She had corrected his deliberate error without ever raising her eyes to his or breaking the propriety of her station. It was a display of intellectual parity that made the silver and silk of the morning room feel like a cheap stage set for a play that was reaching its end. Indeed, the Duke murmured, taking the cup from her. His fingers brushed hers for a fleeting second, a contact that felt like a spark of flint against steel. The cost of the bonnets is a variable most men are too proud to calculate. It is a fatal oversight, and I find that I prefer the company of those who can see the truth in the numbers. Lady Clarissa's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face before being smoothed away by her practiced vanity. She sensed a shift in the air, a current she could not name, and it made her cruel as only a cornered animal can be. She looked at Elizabeth, seeing only a tool that was beginning to show an inconveniently sharp edge. "Go to the kitchens, Elizabeth," Lady Clarissa commanded, her tone dropping into a cold sneer that dripped with contempt. "You have mucking to do in the larder, and you are clearly distracted by things beyond your station. We cannot have the help providing commentary on matters of state or finance." Elizabeth Sterling curtsied, a movement of perfect, empty propriety. She felt the gaze of Arthur Vance on her back as she retreated, a weight that was no longer a judgment, but a promise of a reckoning. As she crossed the threshold, she heard the Duke's voice rise, cold and iron-hard, as he redirected Clarissa's attention back to the grim reality of the ledgers. The mansion was no longer merely caught in a fearful pause. It was beginning to groan under the pressure of a truth that could no longer be contained within the rotting walls. The afternoon brought no relief, only a different kind of suffocation. The kitchens of Thorn Manor were a cavern of frantic labor, the air thick with the smell of roasting meats, rendered fat, and the sharp acidic scent of vinegar used to scrub the neglect of years. Elizabeth was tasked with the silver, a mountain of trays, pitcherines, and heavy candelabras that had not seen the light of day since her father's passing. Lady Clarissa was determined that the gala would be a display of opulence that would dazzle Duke Arthur into leniency, unaware that every polished spoon was a testament to a debt she could never pay. Elizabeth worked until her arms ached and her vision blurred, her mind still dancing with the columns of the Duke's confidential ledger. She was calculating the risks of the Duke, mapping the systematic drainage of his northern estates that his own men had missed. It was a massive puzzle, a labyrinth of shadows, and she was the only one with the thread to lead him out. The contrast between her mental freedom and her physical servitude was a bitter draught, but she drank it with a straight spine and a silent heart. A sharp clatter of heels announced the entry of Lady Clarissa into the scullery. She looked wildly out of place among the soot and the steam, her silk skirts drawn up to avoid the damp floor. She looked at the silver tray Elizabeth was polishing, her reflection caught in the distorted, gleaming surface. "The gala is the only thing that matters now, Elizabeth," Lady Clarissa said, her voice trembling with a suppressed rage that was born of pure fear. "Duke Arthur is a man of stone, and he is looking for a reason to ruin us. He watches everything. He has a way of looking at a room and seeing every crack in the plaster and every stain on the rug." She stepped closer, her perfume a cloying, artificial wall against the honest, earthy smells of the kitchen and the larder. "You will serve as a maid during the gala," Lady Clarissa ordered, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth with a predatory intensity. "You will wear the grey uniform, and you will keep your head down. You are to be a shadow, do you hear me? A silent, invisible drudge. If you speak to a single guest, if you so much as raise your eyes to Duke Arthur, I will see you married to Mr. Blackwood before the sun rises the following morning. I will sell you to pay for the candles if I have to." Elizabeth did not flinch, even as the name of Percival Blackwood was used like a whip. She looked at the silver tray, seeing the architecture of her own suppression reflected in the metal. "I understand my place, Lady Clarissa," Elizabeth said, her voice like cool water over heated stone. "I doubt that you do," Lady Clarissa sneered, leaning in so close that Elizabeth could see the cracks in her heavy powder. "You have always had a stubborn streak of pride, a belief that your little secrets and your hidden books make you something more than you are. But in the eyes of the world you are nothing. You are a slow-witted, penniless orphan who cannot even read a simple invitation, let alone a man's heart. Do not forget that. You are the invisible daughter of a dead man, and you will stay in the shadows where you belong until you are sold to the highest bidder." Lady Clarissa turned on her heel, her silk skirts hissing against the stone floor like a snake in the grass. She left behind a silence that felt heavy and thick, a darkness that attempted to snuff out the fire in Elizabeth's mind. But Elizabeth Sterling only picked up the polishing cloth and returned into the silver tray. She polished until the metal shone like a mirror, until it was an unforgiving sort of glass that reflected not a servant, but a woman who was waiting for the scales to tip. The house was a living history, and tonight it was a history of theft and resilience. Elizabeth thought of the £75 missing from the winter stores, the forged signatures on the land deeds, and the grief of the Duke that he had worn like weather for 7 years. She realized then that being seen by the right person was not the danger, it was the only safety worth the name. She would wear the grey uniform, and she would carry the serving tray, but she would not be silent forever. The columns of commerce were the ultimate arbiters of reality, and she was the architect of its final balance. As the shadows lengthened and the first carriages began to rattle up the drive, Elizabeth Sterling felt the change in the air. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was in the hallway, breathing through the vents. She looked at her ink-stained fingertips, the mark of her secret labor, and then at the silver tray that would be her shield and her weapon in the coming hours. The debt was nearly due, and the calculation was perfect. The dining room of Thorne Manor was a theatre of desperate vanity, an opulent stage set designed to distract the eye from the structural rot that lay beneath the gilded surface. The air was thick and suffocating, a heavy tapestry woven from the scent of expensive beeswax candles, the metallic tang of polished silver, and the cloying, artificial lilies that Lady Clarissa had ordered to mask the persistent smell of damp earth that rose from the cellar. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it provided no true warmth. It was a hungry, restless thing that cast long, flickering shadows against the mahogany paneling, shadows that seemed to reach out for the gathered nobility like skeletal fingers. At the head of the table sat Arthur Vance, the Duke Arthur, his presence a silent and tectonic weight that anchored the room. He wore his charcoal evening coat with a stoic grace, his broad shoulders casting a massive silhouette that made the surrounding guests appear like fragile, colorful insects pinned to a board. His grey eyes, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake, remained fixed on the red wine in his glass, the liquid reflecting the candlelight in a stagnant pool of crimson. Elizabeth Sterling moved through the periphery of this gilded scene, a ghost in a grey wool uniform that felt like a second skin of erasure. She carried a heavy silver tray laden with roasted pheasant, her movements possessing the fluid, rhythmic precision of a well-oiled machine. Her spine was a straight and uncompromising line, a vertical ledger that refused to bend even under the weight of the silver or the crushing atmosphere of the room. Every footfall was calculated, every gesture a study in the suppression of self. To the guests, she was merely a component of the house's furniture, a silent drudge whose purpose was to facilitate their comfort without ever intruding upon their consciousness. But beneath the plain bodice of her uniform, her heart beat with the sharp clarity of a clock. Her ink-stained fingertips were tucked beneath the edge of the tray, a secret mark of her nightly rebellion that she had scrubbed until the skin was raw, yet the darkness remained, a permanent signature of her true nature. Lady Clarissa presided over the conversation with a brittle and percussive brilliance, her laughter a sound like breaking glass that echoed too loudly in the vaulted chamber. She was draped in a gown of emerald silk that the estate could not afford, the fabric hissing whenever she moved, sounding like a serpent in the tall grass. Beside her sat Percival Blackwood, his predatory gaze tracking Elizabeth's movements with a chilling financial interest. He did not see a woman, he saw a commodity to be acquired, a blank slate upon which he could write his own desires. The conversation drifted, as it often did under Clarissa's direction, toward the lamentable state of the local labouring class and the supposed intellectual deficiencies of those born to serve. It was a performance of social gatekeeping, a way to solidify her own precarious standing by diminishing the humanity of those who actually maintained the architecture of her life. The difficulty with the lower orders, Lady Clarissa noted, her voice carrying a sharp, aristocratic edge that cut through the low murmur of the table, is their fundamental inability to grasp the complexities of logic or the simple mechanics of a civilized mind. They are creatures of instinct and appetite, much like the hounds in the kennel, only far less reliable in their loyalty. She paused, her gaze flickering toward Elizabeth as the girl leaned over to refill Percival Blackwood's wineglass. A cruel, calculated light entered Clarissa's eyes, the kind of light that preceded a strike. She saw the way Duke Arthur's attention had subtly shifted, his eyes tracking the servant's hand with an intensity that Clarissa found deeply unsettling. She decided then to extinguish any spark of interest before it could catch. "Take our Elizabeth here," Clarissa continued, her tone dropping into a mock pity that was more corrosive than an outright insult. She has been under my care for 7 years, and yet I find her mind is as stagnant as a blocked drain. I have tried to provide her with the most basic of educations, purely out of a sense of Christian charity, but it was a wasted effort. The girl is a constitutional void. She cannot even read a simple grain receipt, let alone the sophisticated literature of the ton. To her, a book is merely a heavy object used to prop open a door. Is that not right, Elizabeth? Speak up, child. Do not be shy in front of Duke Arthur. Tell the table of your struggle with the alphabet. A hush fell over the dining room, the kind of silence that had teeth. The guests paused, their forks suspended in midair, as they waited for the public humiliation of a servant. It was a sport they enjoyed, a way to reassure themselves of their own inherent superiority. The embattled girl refused to avert her gaze. She stood perfectly still, the heavy silver tray a shield between her and the sneering faces. She felt the heat of the Duke's gaze on her face, a physical pressure that demanded a response. But she remembered the threat Clarissa had whispered in the scullery. The threat of Mr. Blackwood and a life of forced silence. She saw the world as a column of numbers, and the cost of speaking was currently higher than the value of the truth. "I am as you have made me, Lady Clarissa," Elizabeth replied, her voice a cool and steady stream that betrayed no emotion. It was a masterpiece of subtext, a truth that Lady Clarissa was too vain to decipher. "You see," Clarissa said, turning back to Duke Arthur with a triumphant, brittle smile. "Dull obedience is her only accomplishment. She is a blank slate, Mr. Blackwood, perfectly suited for a household that requires a shadow rather than a soul. It is a mercy, really. A mind that cannot think is a mind that cannot suffer." Lucinda and Seraphina giggled, their fans fluttering like the wings of nervous birds. The air in the room grew colder, the house itself seeming to freeze completely as the insult hung in the air like a foul mist. But the silence was broken not by more laughter, but by the sharp, definitive click of a ring against crystal. Arthur Vance had set his glass down with a force that vibrated through the mahogany table. He did not look at Lady Clarissa. He looked directly at Elizabeth, his grey eyes burning with a sudden incandescent recognition. "A blank slate is a rare and valuable thing in a world of scribbled lies, Lady Clarissa," the Duke stated, his voice deep and resonant, possessing the weight of a mountain. "But I have often found that those who claim to see nothing are simply blinded by their own lack of perspective. A ledger may look like a prop to a fool, but to a person of intellect, it is the truest reflection of a man's deeds." He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat and withdrew the Malvern Black Book. The sight of the ledger at a formal dinner table was a breach of propriety so staggering that the room seemed to tilt. The black leather binding was worn at the edges, and the black wax seal of the Malvern crest glinted like a dark eye. He slid the dark leather volume across the table, the sound of the heavy volume meeting the wood echoing through the chamber like the strike of a gavel. "For 7 years, Duke Arthur continued, his voice dropping into a hoarse, intimate register that excluded everyone but the girl in the grey uniform. "I have been plagued by a ghost in my own books, a discrepancy in my northern accounts that has bled me of £10,000, a sum that my most educated stewards, men with titles and degrees, have failed to explain. They tell me the math is sound, but I have worn my grief like weather, and I know when a storm is being manufactured." He did not stop the book until it rested directly in front of Elizabeth Sterling. The guests gasped, a collective sound of shock. To hand such a document to a servant was an act of madness. "Since you cannot read, Elizabeth," Duke Arthur said, his words a challenge that carried the sharp edge of a blade, "perhaps you can merely look at these numbers. My stewards say the ghost is in the 4th quarter. I would have you tell me if they are correct, or if they are merely looking at the wrong column." Lady Clarissa stood up, her hand outstretched. "Duke Arthur, this is an absurdity. The girl is a simpleton. You cannot entrust the secrets of Malvern to a drudge who cannot tell a 5 from a 0. Sit down, Lady Clarissa," the Master of Malvern commanded, a low roar that pinned the woman to her seat. "The dignity of Malvern is my concern, and I find that I have more trust in a girl with ink-stained fingers than in a house built on the theft of its own children." Elizabeth Sterling looked down at the momentous ledger. The vellum pages were thick and cool. She felt the weight of the room on her shoulders. She opened the book, the numbers marched across the page, but to Elizabeth they were a living architecture. She saw the systematic complexity immediately, a labyrinth of deferred interest and hidden brokerage fees. Her mind raced through the arithmetic, identifying the secret alphabet of the deception. It was not a simple error. It was a layered fraud designed to be invisible to the standard eye. Elizabeth looked up, her face a study in cold clarity. She did not speak with the deference of a servant. "Duke Arthur, your stewards are looking at the wrong ledger entries entirely. The discrepancy is not a phantom of the 4th quarter. It is a hidden layer of cross-references buried within the grain tithes, however." She paused, her voice steady. "This is not a ghost that can be exorcised in a few minutes over a dinner plate. To reconcile a £10,000 loss hidden over 7 years requires the kind of focused audit that this room cannot provide. The table remained frozen. Lady Clarissa was ashen, her fingers twisting the fabric of her gown. Percival Blackwood looked as though he had been struck by lightning, a sharp, calculating fear in his eyes. Arthur Vance watched Elizabeth, his grey eyes tracking the way she held the book with a frightening, beautiful intelligence. Arthur grasped that she didn't just read the numbers, she mastered the concept of their hidden weight. "Then you shall have the silence you require," Duke Arthur said, his voice vibrating with a profound and reverent pride. "Tomorrow at dawn, Elizabeth, you will bring the Malvern Black Book to the library. You will have the day to find the true name of this ghost, and you, Lady Clarissa, will ensure she is not disturbed by the trifles of the scullery." Lady Clarissa opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat as she met the Duke's cold, unrelenting gaze. She was not yet defeated, but the foundation of her control was trembling. The dinner was no longer a feast for her vanity. It was the preamble to a reckoning. Elizabeth Sterling stood straight, the silver tray forgotten, her mind finally engaging with a challenge worthy of its depth. The debt was not yet settled, but the calculation had begun. The silence in the dining room of Thorn Manor had become a sharp, predatory stillness. The quiet, it appeared, was laced with venom. Elizabeth Sterling stood at the edge of the mahogany table, her straight spine anchored against the crushing weight of the room's scrutiny. Her grey wool uniform, meant to render her invisible, stood in stark contrast to the shimmering emerald silks of the gathered nobility. The heavy silver cutlery gleamed coldly under crystal chandeliers. Before her lay the ducal ledger, its dark leather cover absorbing the flickering candlelight like a void. She did not look at the guests' bewildered faces. Instead, she looked at the vellum pages, where the ink of 7 years told a story no one else possessed the vocabulary to understand. The darkened ends of her digits, the very marks of isolated labor for which she had been so recently mocked, moved toward the first column of figures with the precise care of an architect. Lady Clarissa remained frozen, her hand clutching her wineglass so tightly her knuckles shone white. The emerald silk of her gown hissed with every shallow breath. "She can't even read," her stepmother sneered, her voice trembling with volatility she could not suppress. "The girl is a blank slate. She cannot comprehend the alphabet, let alone the complex arithmetic of a ducal estate. She is a creature of the scullery, fit only for mending lace. To place your private ledgers before her is not an audit. It is a desecration of your family's privacy, and an insult to every person of quality at this table." Duke Arthur sat at the head of the table, his broad shoulders casting a protective shadow. He did not speak immediately. He was a monument to quiet devastation, a wounded aristocrat who had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, searching for a truth hidden in the margins of his own life. His grey eyes were fixed on Elizabeth Sterling, watching her mind engage with the challenge. He had seen her at the Oakhaven Inn, watched her resolve Mr. Miller's dispute with supernatural speed. "If she is a blank slate, Lady Clarissa," Arthur Vance murmured, a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, "then perhaps it is time we see what the ink reveals when held to the light." Elizabeth Sterling began turning the pages. The sound of heavy paper moving against mahogany was a rhythmic pulse marking the beginning of the reckoning. To the uninitiated, the ledger was a mere mausoleum of dry facts, columns of black ink marching toward an inevitable sum. But to Elizabeth, the vellum was terrifyingly alive. The scent of iron gall ink and aged leather rose to meet her, a familiar perfume speaking of order and incontrovertible truth. Her mind possessed a forensic intuition, a secret alphabet she had taught herself using discarded receipts in the cold, drafty attic. That desolate space had been her schoolroom, while Lucinda and Seraphina memorized romantic poetry for wealthy suitors below. Elizabeth had wrapped her shivering shoulders in a thin shawl and taught herself the unforgiving poetry of double-entry bookkeeping by the light of a single tallow candle. She had learned to read the true character of a soul by the scrupulous way one calculated their capital. She traced the flow of wealth as a bloodline being systematically bled by a parasite. Her ink-stained fingers paused at the third column of the second quarter, her grey eyes narrowing at a subtle inconsistency. The arithmetic here was elegantly constructed to deceive a casual glance, but Elizabeth possessed a mind that demanded the total architecture of the truth. She saw the grain tithes of the northern estates, the rigid columns immediately transformed into physical realities. She calculated the shipping weights, the heavy tonnage of wheat that should have traveled by barge, and weighed them meticulously against the tax yields recorded adjacent. The ratio was constitutionally impossible. If the tax yields were truly this low, the fields would have to be barren, yet the exorbitant transport costs indicated a full harvest requiring multiple wagons. She cross-referenced this discrepancy with the deferred interest rates recorded 3 pages prior. It was a complex layer of accounting involving consolidated annuities, deliberately designed to appear as unfortunate crop failures. The arithmetic was a masterclass in obfuscation. Yet mathematics is constitutionally steadfast, only the human hand bends it toward deceit. Elizabeth recognized the exact mathematical stutter she had found in Lady Clarissa's discarded dressmaker bills, now scaled to the massive magnitude of the Malvern fortune. "The ghost you are seeking, Duke Arthur," Elizabeth said, her voice rising with cool, clinical authority, "is not a phantom of the fourth quarter. It is a parasite that has been feeding on the primary ledger for 7 years. Here in the cross-references for the grain tithes, there is a systematic redirection of funds. £10,000 recorded as a settlement for a timber contract in the north was never fulfilled." She traced the line of ink. The timber was never felled, and the product was never delivered, because the brokerage firm listed here does not exist in the physical world. It exists only on these pages to absorb the interest that should have been redirected into the estate's infrastructure. The interest alone over 7 years has compounded into a phantom debt masking direct withdrawals from the primary accounts. Beside Lady Clarissa, Mr. Blackwood leaned forward, his predatory eyes darting between the ledger and the girl. A master of cold calculations, he realized with a visceral chill that the girl standing before the Duke operated on a mathematical plane he could not map. The architecture of his own deception, built on draining the sterling inheritance through fraudulent consoles, was exposed to a light as unforgiving as winter dawn. He had thought her a simpleton to be bullied into a marriage of convenience, but now saw her mind was an absolute fortress. The grey wool uniform was merely a facade masking an intellect that could dismantle his life's work in minutes. Elizabeth turned the page, finding the more domestic betrayals. "And here," she continued, her finger resting on a specific entry, £50 allocated for the urgent repair of the north eaves and rotting slate. The work was never commissioned. Instead, the funds were converted into a personal voucher for a milliner in London. "I believe Lucinda wore the result of that supposed repair to church last Sunday, a silk bonnet of imported lace costing more than the annual wages of 3 stable hands." Lucinda gasped, her face turning mottled red. Seraphina shrank back, her obsession with status feeling like a leaden weight. The Dowager Augusta, sitting at the far end of the table, let out a sharp, dry laugh cutting through the tension. She leaned back, adjusting her cashmere shawls with profound satisfaction, recognizing true intelligence. "A roof made of silk," Dowager Augusta remarked, her eyes twinkling with dangerous aristocratic wit. "How very innovative of you, Lady Clarissa. I suppose it keeps the rain out just as well as the lies keep the truth at bay." Lady Clarissa rose with a trembling, rigid poise. The emerald silk of her gown rustled sharply in the stifling quiet. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice like shattering glass. "The girl is a liar. She has stolen into the private records to manufacture a scandal. Duke Arthur, I demand you have her removed this instant. She is mentally unfit. She is a creature of dull delusions, confusing chores with imagination." Lady Clarissa made a sharp, desperate movement across the table. She meant to snatch the condemning evidence and consign it to the hearth, desperate to erase the numbers dismantling her empire. But before her pale fingers could graze the dark leather binding, a hand of iron caught her wrist. Arthur Vance stood up, his movement so swift the candles flickered. He held Lady Clarissa's wrist with a grip cold and unrelenting as stone. He did not roar. His voice was a low rumble carrying the authority of a king. "Sit down, Lady Clarissa," Duke Arthur commanded. "The only delusions in this room are the ones you attempted to weave around this girl. You called her a blank slate to mask the fact she is the only soul in this house with the integrity to look at a ledger and tell the truth. You spent 7 years attempting to bury her mind in the attic, unaware she was using your own crimes to educate herself. Numbers don't lie. People lie about them." He released her wrist with a gesture of profound disgust, as if discarding rotted fruit. Lady Clarissa collapsed back into her chair, her dress looking suddenly like a shroud. The guests, sensing the massive shift in power, distanced themselves, their faces turned toward Elizabeth Sterling with a mixture of awe and dawning respect. Mr. Miller, the merchant invited as a mere witness to the estate's stability, nodded slowly. His eyes were bright with the profound recognition of the genius he had seen at the inn. "Elizabeth Sterling is not a servant in this house," Duke Arthur announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vaulted dining room. "She is the daughter of a man whose legacy you attempted to dismantle piece by piece. She has shown me more of the truth in 10 minutes than my own stewards have provided in a decade. She has identified the systematic fraud of the grain tithes and the embezzlement of the repair funds with a precision that makes a mockery of your claims of her illiteracy." He turned to Elizabeth, his expression softening fractionally as he looked at the ink-stained fingertips that had once been her shame. He watched the way she stood, unbowed by the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. "You said that a ledger is the one honest room in the world," Arthur Vance whispered, intended only for her. "Tonight you have proven that the architecture of a soul is built on truth, not titles." He looked back at the room, his gaze hardening once more. The great hall was steeped in a profound stillness, the very walls seeming to lean in to hear his final judgment. The night is late, and the revelation of these crimes requires a formal proceeding. Elizabeth, you will take the primary estate folio to the library. At dawn, you will begin a full forensic audit of every record belonging to this estate and my own. You shall have the keys to the archives and the full authority of my seal. He looked directly at Lady Clarissa, his eyes like chips of flint. And as for you, Lady Clarissa, you will ensure she is not disturbed. You will not cross the threshold of the library. You will not speak to her. You will remain in your quarters until the audit is complete and the full extent of your debt to this house and to the Crown is calculated. If I find that a single page has been tampered with, or a single hair on this girl's head has been harmed, the consequences will be legal, immediate, and final. Duke Arthur walked around the table, his charcoal coat brushing against the mahogany chairs until he stood directly beside Elizabeth. He did not touch her, respecting the space her brilliance had carved for itself, but his presence was an absolute sanctuary. Being seen by the right person was not the danger, she realized. It was the only safety worth the name. Blackwood, the Duke added, glancing at the debt collector trying to vanish into the shadows. I suggest you stay. Your signatures appear on several of these fictitious timber contracts, and I believe our High Auditor will have many questions for you when the sun rises. Elizabeth Sterling looked at the man who had truly seen her, the weight of the Malvern Black Book, now a familiar and welcome burden in her arms. The manor was no longer braced for a blow. It was exhaling the accumulated misery of a decade. She felt the chill of the coming dawn, but she did not fear it. The ink-stained fingertips were no longer the marks of a nobody. They were the hands of the woman who would restore the balance of the world. The library will be ready for me, Duke Arthur, Elizabeth said, her voice steady and true. Then the reckoning begins at first light, Arthur Vance replied. The guests began to depart in a hushed, reverent chorus, leaving Lady Clarissa a silent and broken figure in a dress that no longer glittered. The dinner was over and the house settled into a heavy, expectant waiting. The candles in the dining room burned low, casting long shadows across the mahogany. But for Elizabeth Sterling, the darkness was finally receding. The lingering scent of beeswax and roasted mutton slowly gave way to the crisp smell of rain falling outside the tall windows, striking the glass like thrown coins. Winter was not a guest here, but a hearth fire had finally been lit. The library of Thorn Manor had undergone a transformation that was more profound than any superficial redecoration could ever achieve. The heavy velvet curtains, which had for years served to trap the stale air of secrets, the scent of damp wool, and the fine grey dust of neglect, were now drawn wide, allowing the pale cold light of the morning to illuminate the room's skeletal, uncompromising honesty. The massive mahogany desk, once the site of Lady Clarissa's frantic and clumsily forged attempts to obscure the estate's inevitable decline, had become the command center of a rigorous forensic campaign. Elizabeth Sterling sat at the center of this burgeoning order, her spine a straight and uncompromising line that seemed to support the very ceiling of the house. Before her lay the new estate ledger, its pristine vellum pages waiting to receive the truth that had been suppressed for 7 long years. The structure was no longer stiffened in dread. It was beginning to breathe with the steady, rhythmic pulse of a patient whose fever had finally broken. Elizabeth felt the slight grit of the ink beneath her nails, a tactile reminder of the labor that had been her only companion in the attic. But today the ink did not feel like a stain of servitude. It felt like the weight of a scepter. Arthur Vance, the Duke of Malvern, stood by the window, his presence a silent and watchful sanctuary. He had not slept, yet he did not appear weary. Rather, he possessed the revitalized energy of a man who had finally found a map out of a labyrinth. He watched as her dark, smudged hands moved across the grain-tithe cross-references with a terrifying precision, employing the secret alphabet of numbers she had taught herself from discarded receipts. She was not merely counting coins. She was performing an anatomy of a decade of corruption, slicing through layers of deceit with surgical care. Every scratch of her quill was a calculated stroke against the lies that had nearly hollowed out her inheritance. She paused for a moment, her gaze tracing the jagged ink of a ledger entry from 3 winters ago, seeing not just a number, but the hunger of the tenants it represented. Arthur Vance looked at her, and at last the weather of his grief felt as though it were finally yielding to a clear, cold spring. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared fortress of mutual understanding. She remained immersed in her work when the Duke approached the desk, carrying a tray of black coffee he had secured from the kitchens himself. She was deep within the architecture of the timber brokerage accounts, tracing the phantom transactions that had served as the private trough of Percival Blackwood. She saw the systematic complexity of the theft, the way the numbers had been shuffled like a deck of cards to ensure the house always lost. It was a masterpiece of malicious intent, but it was constitutionally incapable of standing up to the scrutiny of a mind that saw the world in absolute columns. She reached out and took the cup from the Duke, her fingers brushing his with a familiarity that was born of shared intellectual respect rather than mere social proximity. The warmth of the porcelain was a stark contrast to the cold arithmetic she was unraveling, a grounding tether to the present moment. The systematic fraud committed against this estate is far more vast than a simple case of mismanagement, Duke Arthur, Elizabeth noted, her voice carrying the cool, clinical weight of a woman delivering a final verdict. According to these records, £10,000 were allocated for the clearing of the northern woods and the consolidation of grain tithes over the last 3 years. Yet, the northern woods remain untouched by a single axe, and the grain tithes were never reconciled with the village tallies. The money was paid to a brokerage that exists only as an accommodation address on a derelict city street. A receiving house I have identified through these secondary manifests as belonging to the brother of Percival Blackwood. She turned the page, her finger resting on a much smaller yet perhaps more insulting entry, and here, a withdrawal of £50, ostensibly for the repair of the manor's leaking roof in the west wing. Yet, as the rain continues to dampen the floorboards in the nursery, I find a matching receipt from a high street milliner for a watered silk bonnet, delivered to Lucinda Thorne on the very same day. It seems my stepmother valued a ribbon over the structural integrity of her own home. Duke Arthur leaned over the desk, his charcoal coat absorbing the morning light and casting a shadow that seemed to protect the very pages she studied. He looked at the entries she had highlighted, seeing the pattern of the fraud as clearly as if it were a physical stain upon the vellum. "It is a bold deception," he agreed, his voice a low rumble of suppressed indignation. He assumed that because the estate was in the hands of a woman he deemed incompetent, no one would ever look at the logs of the bargemen. He counted on the silence of the house to protect the noise of his theft. He did not account for the daughter of the house having eyes that could see through the dark. "Numbers do not lie, Duke Arthur," Elizabeth replied, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that burned away any remaining shadows of her former life. "People lie about them, and they rely on the arrogance of their own rank to ensure that those who see the truth remain silent. But a financial record is an unblinking mirror, and Mr. Blackwood has left his signature in every corner of this one." He did not realize that while he was busy emptying the cellars, the girl in the attic was keeping account of her own. He mistook my invisibility for absence. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere of the house shifted from the quiet intensity of the library to a cold, iron-hard anticipation in the morning room. Lady Clarissa had remained in her quarters, a prisoner of her own ruined vanity and the crushing weight of the Duke's public dismissal at dinner. However, the arrival of Percival Blackwood at the front gates signaled the beginning of the final reckoning. He entered the house with the practiced confidence of a man who still believed his own lies were indistinguishable from the truth. He wore a coat of fine wool and a smile that was as sharp and hollow as a razor. He tossed his gloves to a footman with a casual arrogance that felt brittle in the face of the house's new observant silence. The morning room was a study in high-stakes tension, framed by tall windows that offered a view of the frost-hardened gardens. Duke Arthur stood in front of the hearth, a figure of undeniable and terrifying authority that seemed to dwarf the room itself, his very stillness a warning. Elizabeth Sterling sat to his right at a small table, the Duke's personal logs and the new estate ledger open before her like wounds that had finally been cleaned and bound. Mr. Blackwood entered with a shallow bow, his eyes immediately seeking out Elizabeth with a predatory flick that turned to a cold, suspicious glint when he saw her position of prominence. The rich smell of heavily oiled leather from his boots clashed unpleasantly with the austere scent of old paper and ink that now defined Elizabeth's presence. "Duke Arthur," Mr. Blackwood began, his voice smooth and cloying, "I trust the morning finds you well. I was surprised to receive such an early summons, particularly given the festive nature of last night's events. I had hoped we might discuss the finalization of the sterling debts in a more private setting." "The setting is entirely appropriate for the business at hand, Mr. Blackwood," the aristocrat declared, his tone possessing the weight of a mountain about to move. "We are here to discuss the settlement of accounts, though I believe you will find the final balance somewhat different from what you had anticipated. Elizabeth Sterling has been most scrupulous in her review. Elizabeth, if you would be so kind as to present the findings regarding the systematic theft of £10,000. Elizabeth Sterling did not flinch as the gaze of Mr. Blackwood fixed on her with a sudden naked malice. She opened the ledger to a specific page, her ink-stained fingertips pointing to the fraudulent timber contracts with a steady hand. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice a truth-telling beacon that cut through the stifling air, "I have spent the morning cross-referencing the payments made to the timber brokerage with the canal transport logs and the local land registry. Not a single barge of timber ever moved toward the coast. Furthermore, the £50 stolen for roof repairs was used to purchase a silk bonnet for Lucinda Thorne. The signature on the authorization of payment, while ostensibly that of my late father, possesses a minute irregularity in the stroke, a hesitation in the ink, that is identical to your own handwriting in the personal loan receipts you provided last month. You fail to account for the angle of a dying man's pen. A flash of genuine visceral fear crossed the face of Mr. Blackwood before being masked by a sneer of desperate arrogance. He stepped toward the table, but the Duke moved an inch, a silent warning that froze the debt collector in his tracks. This is an absurdity. The girl is a common girl who has been playing at scholars in the attic. You cannot take the word of a servant over the signature of a gentleman of standing. I do not take her word, sir, Duke Arthur countered, stepping forward until he loomed over the smaller man like a storm that had finally broken. I take her proof, and the proof is reinforced by the arrival of the local magistrate and 2 constables who are currently waiting in the hallway. They are in possession of an arrest warrant for the systematic embezzlement of the Sterling estate and the forgery of crown-stamped documents. Elizabeth has provided a trail of breadcrumbs that leads directly to your pocket. The smile of Mr. Blackwood finally shattered, leaving his face a raw and ugly map of his own ruined ambition. He looked wildly toward the door, but the presence of the Duke was an absolute barrier. He turned back to Elizabeth, his voice a hiss of pure venom stripped of all polite veneer. You think this makes you a lady. You are still the girl who polished my boots in the hallway. You are nothing but ink and dust. Elizabeth Sterling. You will always be a shadow. I am the keeper of the truths of this house, sir, Elizabeth replied, her spine straighter than it had ever been, and the debt you owe to this family is now calculated to the last farthing. You may have seen me as nothing, but the numbers saw everything, and numbers, as you are about to discover, are remarkably unforgiving to those who try to bend them to a lie. The Duke signaled, and the doors opened to admit the constables. Mr. Blackwood was led from the room in a silence that was far more damaging than any physical outcry could ever be. The sound of his departure was the final punctuation mark on a decade of theft. Elizabeth Sterling watched him go, not with a sense of vengeance, but with the quiet, profound satisfaction of a ledger that had finally been balanced. She felt the weight of her father's legacy finally settling into the stone of the house, no longer a burden of grief, but a foundation of true prosperity. The structure was at last sound. Thorn Manor was finally awake. The cloying scent of Lady Clarissa's expensive lilies had been entirely replaced by the honest, clean smell of beeswax and the faint, metallic tang of fresh ink. Lady Clarissa remained locked in her rooms, a silent and broken figure who would soon be removed to a modest cottage in the north, her unearned authority stripped and her vanity finally laid bare before the world. The house was no longer a mausoleum dedicated to false status. It was a sanctuary of the mind. Duke Arthur returned to the desk, his grey eyes looking at Elizabeth with a recognition that was both a sanctuary and a promise. He saw the woman who had saved his house and her own with nothing more than a quill, an iron will, and the courage to remain brilliant in a cold world. The ghost has been exorcised, Elizabeth, he said, his voice hoarse with a new and thawing hope. But a house that has been empty for so long requires a new hand to guide the records. The Malvern Black Book represents a vast and labyrinthine estate, and I find that I can no longer trust the stewards who only tell me what they think a duke wants to hear. I require a partner who is not afraid of the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried beneath the floorboards. Elizabeth Sterling looked at her work-worn hands, tracing the familiar dark ridges, and then at the man who had looked past her plain grey uniform to see the genius within. I have spent my life in the attic, Duke Arthur, teaching myself to read the secrets that others tried to bury. I do not think I could ever go back to being a shadow in my own home, nor would I wish to hide my intellect behind a polite smile. Then do not be a shadow, Arthur Vance replied, his gaze unwavering and fiercely protective. Be the light that ensures the columns always balance. Be the master of the accounts for my house, and perhaps in time you will find that an account book is not the sole truthful haven worth living in. The future was no longer a dark and uncertain count of days. It was a clean page, and together they would write it with the unbreakable truth of their own hearts. Thorn Manor had stopped fighting its own decay and had begun to thrive, a living history of a woman who had won her place not through luck, nor the superficial charm of a social season, but through the quiet, relentless power of her own mind. The night following the arrest of Percival Blackwood was not a time of celebration, but a period of profound, resonant stillness. The library of Thorn Manor had become a sanctuary of absolute clarity, the air within it no longer heavy with the stagnant dust of deceit, but sharp with the scent of fresh pine ink and the metallic tang of cooling wax. Elizabeth Sterling sat at the massive mahogany desk, her spine a straight and uncompromising line against the high-backed chair, her grey sea eyes reflecting the steady, unwavering flame of a dozen beeswax candles. Before her lay the final volumes of the estate accounts, the ledger lines marching across the vellum with a precision that was more than mere arithmetic. It was a declaration of independence. She felt the slight, familiar grit of dried ink upon her fingertips, a mark she no longer sought to scrub away with desperate pumice. These ink-stained fingers were the cartographers of her own salvation, and never before in those 7 years had she felt so unlike a ghost haunting the margins of another person's story. The estate was no longer clenched in anxiety. It was exhaling, the very floorboards seeming to settle into a deep, restful slumber now that the cancer of theft had been excised from its bones. Arthur Vance, the Duke of Malvern, stood at the far end of the room, his silhouette a dark and powerful anchor against the rows of ancient, leather-bound books. He had spent the hours since the magistrate's departure in a state of quiet, observant reverence, watching Elizabeth move through the labyrinth of figures with a grace that surpassed any dance he had witnessed in the ballrooms of London. He carried a small silver bowl containing the black wax sticks reserved for the most sensitive ducal correspondence, the deep obsidian color a stark contrast to the pale, honest vellum of the sterling accounts. He approached the desk with a measured pace, his charcoal coat brushing against the mahogany with a sound like a long, satisfied sigh. He did not speak immediately, for he understood that the silence between them was a shared architecture, a structure built on the mutual recognition of a truth that did not require the clumsy ornamentation of words. He set the wax and the heavy silver signet ring upon the desk, his grey eyes, the color of a storm that had finally run its course, fixed upon Elizabeth with an intensity that burned away the last remnants of her isolation. "The final balance is struck, Your Grace," Elizabeth noted, her voice carrying a cool, melodic authority that resonated through the quiet library. She did not look up from the page, but she felt his presence as a physical warmth, a sovereign protection that she had never dared to imagine. "Every farthing stolen by Mr. Blackwood and redirected by Lady Clarissa has been traced to its source. The debt is no longer a shadow over this house. It is a mapped territory, ready to be reclaimed. The estate is constitutionally sound once more, provided it is managed by a hand that values the integrity of the ledger over the vanity of the social season." Duke Arthur leaned over the desk, his large, calloused hand coming to rest near the open book. He looked at the columns she had prepared, seeing not just numbers but the resurrection of a lineage. He saw the systematic complexity of her work, the way she had cross-referenced the grain tithes with the local merchant tallies to expose the phantom timber contracts. It was a masterpiece of forensic intellect, a piece of competence that made the efforts of his own high-born stewards appear as the scribblings of children. He felt a profound, surging pride that was not born of his rank, but of the recognition of a peer. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 long years, but looking at the girl with the ink-stained fingers, he felt the first true thaw of a spring that would not be denied. "You have done more than reconcile a debt, Elizabeth," Arthur Vance whispered, his voice hoarse with a new and thawing hope. "You have restored the soul of this house. For 7 years I have searched for a mind that could look at the chaos of my own life and find the pattern of the truth. I have been surrounded by men who speak in circles and women who see only the facade of my title. But you looked at the numbers and you saw me. You saw the grave I was digging for myself and you offered me a ledger instead." He took a stick of the black wax and held it to the flame of a nearby candle, the slow, rhythmic dripping of the dark liquid onto the paper, sounding like the heartbeat of the house itself. The scent of burnt wick and black wax filled the air, a sensory anchor that signaled the finality of their labor. "I have spent my life in a mausoleum of my own making," the Duke continued, his gaze unwavering as he pressed his signet ring into the cooling wax, sealing the record of their victory. "But tonight the silence in this room does not have teeth. It has a voice. It tells me that the future is not a debt to be paid, but a page to be written." Elizabeth finally looked up, her gaze locking with his in a moment of absolute intellectual parity. She saw the man behind the Duke, the wounded aristocrat who had forgotten how to live until a girl from the attic dared to show him the arithmetic of his own worth. She reached out and touched the cool, dark seal, her fingertips resting beside his. "An accounting log is an infallible sanctuary, Arthur," she said, using his given name, finally dropping the shield of his title. "It does not lie, and it does not demand we be anything other than what we truly are. I have spent my life in the shadows, believing that my mind was a burden that made me unfit for the world Lady Clarissa desired. But in this room, with these books, I have found that being seen by the right person is the only safety worth the name." The transition from the library to the dawn was a movement from the dark, introspective beauty of the night into a horizon of unimpeachable clarity. By morning, the house was a living body that had finally found its breath. The heavy, cloying scent of Lady Clarissa's lilies had been entirely replaced by the crisp, honest smell of the morning air and the faint, sweet perfume of late-blooming lilacs drifting through the open windows. The servants moved through the hallways with a new, quiet dignity, no longer cowering under the sharp, percussive commands of a mistress who had viewed them as mere obstacles to her own vanity. Lady Clarissa Thorne had been removed before the first bell, her emerald silks and French lace packed into a single, modest trunk as she was escorted to a small cottage in the north, a place where she would have ample time to calculate the true cost of a life built on the theft of another's heart. Elizabeth stood on the stone portico of Thorn Manor, her plain grey dress replaced by a gown of deep sapphire wool that reflected the rising sun. Her spurs were as straight as a ledger line, her head held high as she looked out over the estate that was finally, legally hers to manage. She held the bound folio in her arms, no longer a secret burden but a symbol of the partnership that would define the rest of her life. She looked at her hands, noting that while the ink had been washed away, the memory of it remained, a permanent signature of the woman she had become. She was no longer the invisible daughter of a dead man. She was the master of accounts, the auditor of the truth, and the mistress of her own destiny. Arthur Vance stepped out from the shadows of the hall to stand beside her, his presence a constant and unwavering sanctuary. He did not look at the horizon. He looked at her, his grey eyes burning with a quiet, profound reverence that made the morning light appear dim by comparison. He had discarded the charcoal coat of his grief for a simpler attire, his stature no longer appearing as a weight, but as a foundation. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the smooth skin where the ink had once been, a gesture of profound, wordless belonging. "The sun is quite honest this morning, is it not?" The Duke murmured, a dry, aristocratic wit touching his voice for once. "It does not pretend that the world is perfect, but it illuminates every corner nonetheless. I believe the stewards at Malvern are currently trembling at the prospect of your arrival. They have had 7 years of silence, and I suspect they are not prepared for a mistress who can read their secrets as easily as a primer." "Let them tremble," Elizabeth replied, a small knowing smile touching her lips. "Numbers do not lie, Arthur, and I have never been fond of a column that does not balance. We have much work to do if we are to turn your house into a sanctuary as warm as this one has become. A ledger might be a truthful refuge, but I think I should like a home that breathes with more than just arithmetic." "Then that is what we shall build," Arthur Vance promised, his voice a steady, unbreakable beacon. "A house that cowers for no one, where every room is honest, and where you are never again asked to be a shadow." Thorn Manor was finally warm, the cold stone infused with the heat of a house that was loved and understood. The architecture of Elizabeth Sterling's soul had expanded to fill every corridor, every library shelf, and every heart that beat within its walls. She had won her place not through the superficial charm of a social season, but through the quiet, relentless power of her own mind, a mind that had dared to believe that even in a world of gilded lies, the truth was the only currency worth the keeping. The debt was settled, the accounts were closed, and a new chapter had begun, written in the indelible ink of a love based on intellectual respect and the courage to be truly seen. As the candles of the past flickered out and the golden light of the future poured over the warm, full, living house, not one soul in it remained paralyzed by fear. The silence was no longer a predator. It was a peace, earned through the scrupulous labor of a woman who had refused to be less than she was. Elizabeth Sterling closed the ledger on her past and opened the world, her hand firmly within the grasp of the man who had looked past her plainness to find the fire beneath the ash. The calculation was perfect, and the balance was finally, eternally struck. Let me know your location in the comments, and tell me if you've ever boldly claimed your undisputed truth despite others dismissing you as insignificant. I review every single message you share here,